the craziest real-life plot twist story you have. Story 1. The 2007 Pepsi 400 at Daytona International Speedway. The date was July 7th, 777, and every commentator in NASCAR's Premier Series was speculating that Clint Bowyer, driver of the Orshadrino 7 Jack Daniels Chevrolet, was destined to win based purely on numeric superstition. At the end of the race, Bowyer did not win. However, he did finish 7th. Story 2. When I was 5 years old, I remember going to a wedding reception for one of my friend's older sisters. I vaguely remember that it was a scandalous that she was young, 18, just graduated HS, and he was much older. That's all I knew. And it didn't come up much in conversation with my friend or their family. 10 years later, I'm in high school on the debate team, just chatting with the coach about random stuff when we get to talking about the team before he was coach. He told me that before him, another teacher was the coach who got kicked out for having a relationship with one of the students on the team. He told me the names and my jaw hit the floor. That was the wedding reception I was at. Story 3. First roommate in college was super Catholic and did not approve of my older. As an attempt to save me, she thought of inviting me to her friend's celibacy celebration while I was doing homework in the commons. A chill wind picked up, and I sensed it was time for me to leave. As I turned around, I saw the only doorway blocked by a circle of people holding hands and quietly chanting, "No S-Readers until 30, no S-Readers until 30. As I approached to try to break through the circle and GTFO, their chanting got louder. I eventually got out, but this chick threw away all of my high-end toys and Suicide Girl book. I was done with living with her and got out after just a quarter. Over a year later, a few friends and I were comparing horror stories about roommates we have had, and I shared my story. A new friend told hers about a super noisily masturbating lesbian. None of the others had much to say, so they voted between the two. Mine won by a small margin, only to find out both of our stories were about the same roommate, just 1 year apart. Oh, also, she did not throw out my SS toys or my Suicide Girl book. Story 4. I was best friends with a neighbor kid growing up. He was always over at my house or I was at his, and I had a major crush on him pretty much since I was old enough to walk. But it never seemed like he liked me back or that he even noticed that I liked him, so we grew up. He started dating people and I was jealous as over it. I started dating people while still pining over him. I figure he just sees me as a little kid. I was a year younger than him, or a little sister, and nothing will ever come out of it, so I try to put my feelings aside. Then when he turned 16, his family moved out of state and we lost contact. I got over my feelings and time moved on. Fast forward a few years later and we reconnect online, start talking, and then this dude casually mentions in a conversation about how he had a giant crush on me growing up and always wanted to ask me out. He tells me that he even asked my mother for permission to ask me out and she said no, so he never ended up doing it. My mom never told me about this at all. My mind is blown. My entire childhood of pining after this guy, my first ever crush, feels like a lie. At this point, I'd long since put aside the feelings I had for him and kinda gotten over the crush, but I still felt a lot of residual nostalgia from being 15 and craving for the first time in my life. He was still into me, and I was debating whether I wanted to start something with him or not, mostly so I wouldn't have to live with the what if of it all, tossing the idea around while we kept in touch. Then suddenly he stops messaging me. I'm like, because our talking was going well and I didn't think I did anything to make him want to start ghosting me. I message a mutual friend of ours and ask if she knows what's up, and she tells me the guy was arrested for beating a dude who owed him money to death. He's in prison right now serving a life sentence. I never got that. The end. Story 5. I posted this in reply to another thread. This is a long and meandering story that came to a climax about 12 years ago. It's one of the most bizarre things that's happened to me and left me rattled and puzzled for a long time. When I was in college, my father retired and moved to New Orleans. He had lived there in his 20s and 30s, and his 2 sons from his first marriage, my half-brothers, still live there. He moved into a cool apartment complex with a swimming pool in the center courtyard and a lot of sociable people his age. One of them was a retired Army general. I'll call him Tom. My dad and Tom were the same age, and both Korean War veterans. My dad had been in the Marines for 4 years during the latter part of the war, while Tom had stayed in and risen through the ranks. Tom had been to Ranger School and the Special Forces Pipeline, and was a country expert for Korea. He was in Korea for most of the Cold War, training ROK Marines, gaming out W3 scenarios, and working closely with a large private corporation I'll not name here doing semi-spook stuff. He retired shortly before September 11th. He was a full colonel at the time and was promoted to Brigadier General, 1-star, just before retirement to sweeten his pension. That was kind of a professional courtesy, due old boy club thing. After 9/11, the government expanded the Federal Air Marshal Service and asked Tom to come out of retirement lead the restructuring. They wanted someone who didn't have a parent command. and since he had been out of the army for a year or so, he was a good candidate. They promoted him to Major General, 2-star, so that he would have clout among the other generals, GS-15 civilian employees, and private sector executives he'd be working with. Colin Powell pinned his 2nd star on him personally in the White House. At this time, I was in the Marine Reserve myself and getting ready to graduate college. I'd not yet been called up for OIF or OEF, so I was looking for my first grown-up job. My dad suggested that being an air marshal could be fun for a year or two, even if it wasn't exactly something I was interested in. I had a clearance and was an expert on the range, not mention I was a friend of the 2-star who was running the program, so I was maybe a step ahead of some of the other candidates. My dad arranged a phone call with Tom to talk about my options. At this point, I'd met Tom many times when I'd go to visit my dad. He was one of the kindest men I've known. We'd sit around the pool and I would pick his brain endlessly about his military experience and the spooky adventures he was at liberty to talk about. As a young enlisted Marine, it's hard to describe the feeling of being close with a 2-star general. I had seen a general maybe 3 times at that point. If you're a lance corporal in a rifle platoon and a major shows up in the barracks, you snap to attention and bark out, "Attention on deck!" like it was Darth Vader walking in the room. Somebody with stars on their collar might just give you a heart attack right there. So to be shooting the with Tom was pretty special for me. Tom was a widower and an old Southern gentleman and dated women here and there. Although he didn't smoke, he always carried a Zippo lighter with him to light a lady's cigarette. He lit a cigarette for me by the pool one day, and I noted that his Zippo had a Ranger crest on it. He said that his daughter had given it to him years before, and he thought it was gaudy at the time. He wasn't the type to advertise his status, but he came to cherish it after his daughter died. She had been an avid equestrian and had died in a car accident in Costa Rica in the 70s or early 80s while she was down there for some kind of riding event. His wife died of cancer some years later. Tom's apartment was covered in photos of his daughter in riding gear. She was beautiful. The dated feel of the portraits frozen in the 1970s, the quiet apartment, and Tom's outward sanguinity were all horribly tragic. At any rate, we spoke on the phone about the Air Marshal program. He couldn't answer a lot of my questions due to operational security, but we talked for about an hour. In the end, another job came up and I didn't opt for the Air Marshal program. Still, my dad would give me regular updates whenever Tom would go back to New Orleans on leave. Once Tom told my father that they'd done computer simulations of a terrorist running up an airplane aisle, and the only part that stayed relatively motionless was the groin. Obviously, in an airplane, you want to hit the target and not the fuselage, so they decided to aim for the groin as part of their doctrine. My dad was a physician and told Tom that there would be a tremendous amount of bleeding, and that would be a problem if they wanted to take anyone alive. Being a curious man, my dad set about coming up with a solution to this in his free time. He sketched out a sort of jockstrap with a hemostatic agent where the cup would be, and gave it to Tom. Tom came back to him some months later and said that a prominent pharmaceutical company was making a prototype. My dad didn't want money or credit. He was just happy to have been involved in solving a small problem for his country. After the Iraq invasion, Tom left the Air Marshal program and worked on Condoleezza Rice's staff as a national security aide. All in all, everyone loved Tom. He and my dad became very good friends in a few short years. Tom took my brother's kids to Saints games. They lived in family neighborhoods where everyone was always sitting on the porch and visiting with each other in the summer. Tom would swing by some evenings, and my niece and nephew and all the neighborhood kids would come running, yelling, "Mr. Tom," as they do in the South. I was mobilized in 2004, and my father died shortly before I deployed to Iraq. I went to New Orleans on emergency leave, and my brothers, their wives, my sister, my girlfriend, and I drove to Grand Isle, Louisiana to scatter his ashes in the Gulf. Tom wore his full dress uniform. After the ashes were in the water, Tom removed his white gloves and threw them in as well. I'd not known this tradition before, but I was touched by it. He choked back tears and had a lump in his voice. Later, he took my sister and me to an expensive dinner at one of the finest restaurants in New Orleans, and told us he was always there for us. Anything we needed, anytime. I fell out of touch with Tom after deploying and coming home. When Katrina hit, I called my sister-in-law Maggie to see if everyone was okay. I asked about Tom, and she said, "Oh my God, you didn't hear about Mr. Tom." I tensed up and said no. What happened? What she said settled over me slowly like slime. Maggie's neighborhood was underwater, and she, my brother, and her kids went to a friend's house on high ground. There were a dozen others there in the same situation. One of them was Tom's older sister, who would have been in her 80s. She and Maggie knew each other by name and reputation, but had not met until then. Maggie introduced herself and asked after Tom. His sister was worried, as she'd not heard from him since the storm. Maggie said, "Well, I wouldn't worry. I bet the government has a list of VIPs to check on, and Mr. Tom is surely on it." Tom's sister said, "Maggie, I don't know what Tom has told you, but Not a general, not a ranger, no air marshal program, no Condoleezza Rice, no Colin Powell, no bleeding out through the groin problem for my dad to waste his time solving. No nothing. Tom was in fact a penny ante lawyer. What was true was that Tom's sister's deceased husband was a Korea vet, a ranger, a high ranker, and a spook. Tom grew up admiring everything about his brother-in-law. At some point, Tom's dreary, real-life lawyer job faded from his reality, and his fantasies replaced them. The truly sick and disturbing thing was that his daughter and ex-wife were very much alive. They'd just written him off when his detachment became too much. So he killed them off in his narrative. Still, his daughter had the heart to take him in after Katrina destroyed the apartment building. We found out later. My girlfriend watched my face collapse as I talked to Maggie, and she was equally devastated when I told her after I got off the phone. I had so many questions. What if I had followed up on the air marshal thing and said, "Hey, Mr. Tom sent me." Then some of the particulars hit me. He said he was only promoted to the general ranks after retirement, so he would have had an answer as to why he wasn't listed in the Army website's general officer biographies. He probably had an answer to the air marshal thing too. It's like writing a screenplay, coming up with plausible explanations for kinks in the story or character development. Maggie ran into him a couple months after Katrina. He was all smiles and Maggie said, "Stop. Your sister told me everything." He just laughed and said, "Oh, that old bat's crazy. That was the last any of us ever heard of him. I've Googled him but not found anything. I'm just glad my father passed away not knowing the truth. He would have been bereft and possibly would have beat the out of him. I'm saddened by my dead father having been played like a fool in his last years. But I'm also sad for Tom. The gloves in the water and all that were bullshit, but his tears weren't, nor his graciousness at dinner with my sister and me. With the life in Washington, D.C. being phony and his relatives having written him off, my dad and our family were really the closest people he had in his life." Story 6. The husband of an elderly couple near me died about a year ago. The wife for most of her adult life had a pretty serious drinking habit, and her husband kept her on track. A month or two after his death, she found someone new off the internet. He quickly moved in, but something wasn't right about him. He'd often be seen buying multiple bottles of vodka and whiskey and taking them home with him. He was doing this every 1 to 2 days. Anyway, soon after the police came asking people in the local area to see if anyone had seen the elderly woman and her new partner, as they believed they had recently got married. This could be because if she was to die, her nice house would be left to him now. He kept buying alcohol for presumably her until 2 police vans, an ambulance, and crime scene investigators were seen outside the house. No one has been seen in or around the house since. At first I thought he was trying to kill this poor woman off through her drinking habit, but got fed up and tried to murder her so he could have the house. But according to neighbors, she killed him to stop the apparent abuse he'd been putting her through. She is apparently in a secure unit now, where she will most likely stay. Story 7. I heard there was this couple who could not conceive kids, but their neighbor had like 3. They couldn't afford artificial insemination. So the guy approaches his neighbor and asks him to impregnate his wife because they really wanted a kid. The neighbor obliges. For months, no pregnancy. Finally, the neighbor's wife admits to the guy she cheated on him to get pregnant. Ended up the neighbor was firing blanks. So afterwards, this guy who wanted his wife to get pregnant ended up suing the neighbor for breach of contract. I am not sure what happened after that. Story 8. I used to have a friend named Tiffany in middle school. I wasn't so good with people and I was a little rough around the edges. I was very jealous because she was incredibly dainty and feminine while I was a begrudging tomboy. In middle school, her very sketchy and violent father withdrew her from classes and we lost contact. She was homeschooled for a while, and then she and her mother escaped to a battered women's shelter and set up a new life in Kentucky. I learned all this from the grapevine. I found her mother, brothers, aunts, and uncles on Facebook, so why couldn't I find her? Over the course of 2 years, I searched every few months for her online, desperate to reconnect and apologize to the friend I had such intense jealousy for, and explain that I was unintentionally rude because I envied how feminine she was, while I felt like a brick wall of a girl. Finally, one day, her mother replied to my friend request, and I found out the reason that I never could find her name on Facebook. He goes by TJ now. TLDR. Old friends reconnect. Ace Ventura, pet detective moment ensues. Story 9. My boyfriend was pressuring me to have a threesome with a woman I kinda knew. I had never done anything with a woman before or had any attraction at all to one, and I ended up not going through with it. He kept encouraging me to spend time with her to get more comfortable with the idea. So I did. Then I left him. For her. Story 10. Not a plot twist per se, but I met a guy online a few years ago and we started hanging out and became good friends. In 2016, he got a Facebook message from a young man telling him that he was his father. He gave his mother's name, And sure enough, my friend had slept with her a few times around when he would have been conceived. He showed me the young guy's Facebook page, and there was a picture of his mother, who looked very familiar to me. I looked at her profile, and sure enough, it was my best friend from high school older sister. She had a kid when she was 16, and he lived with my best friend for a couple of years, and I would babysit him quite a bit. I have about half a dozen photos of me with him when he was a baby. Story 11 plot twist. My mom's second husband, whom she swore had died in a car accident, was actually still alive and living in Africa. I talked to his brother on the phone after randomly finding his name in a list of numbers while I was working as a scam telemarketer. My life is insane. Story 12. Co-worker breaks up with bartender and starts pursuing me. Tells me the ex has been stalking him and won't leave him alone. He makes a point to publicly call out bartender at work for being weird, tells her to leave him alone. We start dating and things are cool for a few weeks. Then, he invites me over for a small party. And oddly enough, the ex is there, so I keep my distance from both of them, as I have no idea what is happening. A few hours in, the ex changes into pajamas, and I realize he got back together with her at some point and never told me. The next day at work, I find out he told everyone that I tried to seduce him, make him cheat on the bartender. They all believed him and treated me like garbage for months after that. His behavior towards me got scarier in and outside of work, and I couldn't tell anyone because I was the lying boyfriend stealer. I never knew depression before this fiasco. Story 13. I had a one-night stand when I was 18 because I was curious. I didn't like it and decided to never bother again. Anyway, I was at a nightclub one night after that and trying to buy a drink at the bar when I happened to look around and saw a guy that looked like the guy I had had the one-night stand with. In order to check, I snottily asked, "What's your name?" And he answered with a different name. It was a different guy. I ended up marrying him. Story 14. I have a very close girlfriend. Everybody in college assumed we were a couple. Plot twist number 1. I came out as gay. Plot twist number 2. She came out as a lesbian 2 years later. None of us had any idea the other was gay before we each left our closet. Story 15. From my own life. It's a small one, but a ridiculous coincidence. 2012, I'm in a bar being chatted up. We're telling funny stories, so I tell the long story of how I ended up almost in a fist fight with a minor celebrity in 1999. I didn't know that the woman I'm talking to had done acting as a teenager, and I definitely didn't know that she had played the same minor celebrity's on-screen girlfriend in 1998. Story 16. One of my buddies was living in a dorm at uni his freshman year. A couple weeks in, his stomach was hurting constantly as soon as he would wake up in the morning, and he decided he should go to the doctor's. The doctor asked him what his daily diet consisted of, and my friend tells him he always drinks a protein shake right before bed. The doctor says to quit drinking the shake before bed and see if that helps. So friend doesn't drink the shake that night and goes to sleep. He wakes up to his roommate trying to take off his pants. It turns out my friend's roommate was putting drugs into his protein shake so he could rape him while he was out. The drugs are what was upsetting his stomach. Story 17. There was this guy when I was growing up who I would call Uncle Jerry. I never knew why, I just assumed it was one of those he's super close to the family, so he's your uncle kind of things. Finally, at the age of 20, I found out he was my dad's uncle, which was surprising because they are 2 months apart in age. There's no real twist here, I guess. I was just a dumb child. Story 18. I know someone in the healthcare field. She told me a story about how a woman tested positive for an STD, and my friend suggests that she bring her partner in to be tested as well. The next day, the lady comes in and brings her boyfriend to be tested. Then the lady tells my friend to wait a minute, and this younger male walks in. She said, couldn't be more than 15, and hands lady what appears to be keys. He then hugs the boyfriend. My friend thinks he was in the car and needs to have parking validated. She said, it happens more often than you think. Nope. The kid was there to get tested as well for sleeping with his dad's EF. Friend had to report it, don't know what came of it, but that's some weird. Story 19. I've grown up hearing about my Cherokee ancestry from my dad's side of the very southern family. One of my cousins has gone on a spirit journey and has spent a good amount of time researching his Cherokee heritage and connecting to our familial roots. The 2-minute version of the family story tells how a patriarch of my family met the woman of his dreams and moved out into the forest to live like a true Cherokee father would. He left the rest of our family behind. Several years ago, my grandmas got very into ancestry, Kami Tower. As they researched our tree, they found that we actually have no Cherokee blood. However, my great-great-great-grandma was a black woman. I think that's enough greats. It makes me so happy to think about my racist uncles and extended family finding out that we are 0% Cherokee and that my generation is 1/16 black. The further you go up my family line, and the more racist my family, the more black we are. I love it. Story 20. I taunted my little sister her entire life about the fact that she looked nothing like me and our dad. I always made "you're adopted" jokes about her and stuff. It became an inside joke between us. I'd tell her we found her on the doorstep and she'd say, "Thank God, that means I'm not actually related to you." My parents kind of frowned at it because it was mean, but my sister could take a joke and she knew I was just teasing her. She joked about it herself. Found out a couple years ago that she was the product of a short-lived affair. My dad accepted her as his own and my parents kept it a secret from everyone. They told her last year. I still make "maybe you're adopted" jokes about her, but they're 100x funnier now. Story 21. I dated someone last year for a couple of months and things were pretty good between us. One day, he grew cold and distant from me out of the blue, and I thought I had done something wrong. Next thing I know, he uploads a picture on Facebook of him kissing a woman. They had been together ever since. Story 22. When I was 15, I started dating my male friend after he asked me out. We've been fairly close for a long time, and a lot of our friends said we should get together, so it kind of felt inevitable. He ended up breaking up with me after a few months, and I was sad for a while, but we stayed friends, so in the end it was all chill. However, whilst we had been together, we were never really affectionate in public, or at all, which was down to my insane anxiety. And a rumor started that we were each other's beards, i.e., we were both gay, but pretending to date each other to cover it up. Laughed it off at the time because I knew I was straight. But goddamn if it isn't 3 years later and he's got a boyfriend and I'm away from home lusting after uni girls. Well played, rumor mill, you called it. Story 23. Used to play an online browser game back in 2003-2006-ish. The game itself wasn't really great, but the community was what made it work. Got to know a lot of people from my guild, and we had an IRC channel that I was one of the main regulars on. Another regular there was a guy from a different country, though also in the EU. We became kind of good online friends, but after we stopped playing the game, contact became increasingly scarce before petering out completely at some point. By then we did have Facebook and friended each other, but we never actually talked. 2 years ago, in a nostalgic moment, I decided to hit some people up again from that game, see if we can have some sort of reunion thing or something maybe. I send a message to the guy, and our conversation went something like this. Me. Hey man, long time no talk. What's up in your life these days? Him. Oh hey, I live in your country now, LOL, with my girlfriend I met online. Me. That's funny. Whereabouts? Him. We talk some more, and the subject of work comes up. He then tells me he works in a different city about 20 minutes further. The city he names is where I was born and where my mother works. I ask him where exactly, and the place he names is right across the canal from my mother's business. Literally a stone's throw away. Funnily enough, I still haven't met him because we fell out of contact again right after that, due to other things going on in our lives. But we plan on meeting up sometime soon. TM. Story 24. My aunt by blood lied about my uncle in order to get a divorce, said he was beating her. Bruises, house damage, the works. Years later, he died and myself and my father admonished his father for saying he was a good man, ECT, at the wake. It was wrong, yes, but we were incensed. Turns out it was all a lie. My uncle died of a broken heart. R.I.P. Kevin. Story 25. My dad was adopted as a baby because his parents were both teens from Catholic families. They were promptly sent to boarding schools across the country from each other, and that was that. Many years later, my dad was researching his genetics to look for potential hereditary health problems and decided to put out a search for his parents. He eventually contacted and met with them separately, but both his mom and dad also got in contact with each other. As it turns out, they both had grown kids and deceased spouses, so they decided to meet up and eventually started dating. About 5 years ago, my brother and I went with my dad to a family reunion, where we discovered his parents were once again in love, and had invited both of their families to my grandpa's farm for a big weekend party. I met close to 100 people I was somehow related to, including dozens of cousins and several aunts and uncles. It was all thanks to my dad that these two huge families came together and made new connections. So he, along with my brother and I, were treated like celebrities all weekend, and everyone wanted to get to know us. My dad's adoptive mother died over a year ago, but now he has 2 new parents who are relatively young and extremely interesting people for him, and my family, to spend time with. We go skiing at my grandpa's condo in Montana, and enjoy summer activities at his huge farm property in Alberta. The whole experience taught me that you're never too old for a new love, and I am happy to be able to have grandparents for many more years to come. Story 26. Lose my virginity in a one-night stand in college. 9 months later, we become neighbors because I moved into the first-floor apartment and she moved into the second-floor apartment. Story 27. My girlfriend of 2 years moved a couple hours away to go to school. We saw each other most weekends. The weekend before Valentine's Day, we were together, and it was great. The next weekend on V-Day, I go to see her at her parents' home. I see through the window as I walk up to the house. Her and her fiancé are showing her parents an engagement ring. Edit additional plot twist as listed in below comments. They got married, and after 6 years she discovered his other wife and kids. He must have been a sweet talker, all right. Thank you all for the concern. This was 26 years ago. I'm doing fine. Story 28. My boyfriend of 2 years broke up with me, and I was pretty upset, but I got asked out on a date and said yes, thinking I was ready. I was wrong. I had a miserable time, couldn't hit it off with this guy even though he was trying. Anyway, he took me to a concert on the other side of the city, an area I'm not familiar with and never go to. On the way home, I'm feeling sad and text my ex, which was lame, but I did it. My date thinks something is wrong with one of his back tires and pulls over into an apartment complex. It's 1 a.m. dark, and I take little notice. While he's outside fiddling with the tire, I get a text back from my ex basically telling me he wished he had never met me and to leave him alone. At this point, I'm trying not to cry and realize how big of a mistake it was to go out that night, and in general just feeling depressed AF, thinking I'll never be happy again. I tell date guy I'm sorry, but I'm not ready to be in a relationship again. The night ends. Cut to 2 months later, I finally feel like I'm moving on and try online dating. I hit it off with a guy I'm talking to, we meet up and have a great time, start dating. The first time he brings me back to his place, it's nighttime. I'm looking around the outside of the apartment complex and can't shake the familiar feeling I had been there before, which didn't make sense because this was 45 minutes from where I lived and not an area I ever went to. On the second night, we leave using the back gate, and it hits me. This was the same apartment complex the guy had pulled off into earlier on that date. I go, oh my God, I almost had an emotional breakdown right here. Long story short, I married the new guy, and we have been together 10 years now. I know it's just a coincidence, but I find it crazy that of all the apartments in Houston, we stopped at the one my future husband lived at. He was literally feet away from me while I was in a car, having one of the lowest moments in my life and feeling like I would never find someone again. Story 29. My maternal grandfather's father was an immigrant. His mother divorced his father while my grandfather was very young, remarried, and had grandpa get adopted by her new husband, who was still always referred to as a stepfather because he was a drunk, and grandpa hated him. Mom grew up hearing that her biological grandfather was French, and her grandmother divorced him after he bought a dress for another woman. And she was so angry with him she even refused to admit they'd ever been married. So he got deported back to Europe. When Mom was in high school, her grandmother let it slip that her biological grandfather wasn't French at all. He was Italian. The Italians were on the wrong side of W1cis. So Grandpa lied to avoid facing more prejudice than he already did for being raised by a single mother and having an immigrant father. This was actually a valid concern. Grandma told Mom she'd never have married Grandpa if she'd known he was Italian. When I was a small child, the story was that my great-grandfather was Italian. He'd bought a dress for another woman, and my pissed-off great-grandma divorced him and had him deported. My mom's a genealogy fanatic, so she made some attempts to get records from the Italian government but didn't really find anything, even when we went and visited Italy after my best friend moved there when I was in the 7th grade. A few years later, we found out why. My biological great-grandfather was never deported. He'd moved to Detroit, gotten remarried to a woman with almost the same name as my great-grandmother, and had a son. Grandpa, who was his 80s, found out that he has a half-brother he'd never known about. Not only that, but his biological father might never have bought a dress for another woman. Yeah, there's an alternate story where he used to joke that he and my great-grandmother weren't really married because they'd never had a Catholic ceremony. She was Baptist, he was Catholic. Great-grandma got mad, threatened to divorce him if he did it again, then did. And as it turns out, they may not have been legally divorced. My great-grandma allegedly paid her uncle, who was a judge, to divorce them because my great-grandfather didn't want to get divorced. But there's no record of them being divorced, and apparently my great-grandfather had a very hard time getting remarried. Now the fact that my great-grandmother had to go on a trip to get married makes a lot more sense. My great-grandfather also tried to stay in contact with my grandpa and provide for him, but my great-grandmother wouldn't let him. None of her relatives were even allowed to mention my great-grandfather and were afraid to talk about him until after she died. So we believe that's true. We've met my great-uncle. He is frighteningly similar to my grandfather in some ways that can only be explained by genetics. They both laugh the same way, do this weird side hug thing where they pull you in really tightly, and like to clasp both your hands when they talk to you about anything involving feelings. He has the same eyes as my mom, and likes sports and genealogy like her too. It's pretty cool and I wish we'd found out about him sooner. TLDR. Mom found out her grandfather was Italian, not French. Grandpa found out his dad didn't willingly abandon him and wasn't as bad as his mom said. We found out great-grandma was even more of a piece of work than we thought. And also Grandpa has a half-brother.